As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, colleges, and universities, and then in 1954, succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to abolish legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then that Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 gave inspiration, stimulus to a civil rights movement of activism, of people engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives. Some people severely injured. We just spent a while celebrating the life of John Lewis, who talked about making good trouble to achieve racial justice. Well, that civil rights movement, by the end of the 1960s, had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everyone, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. It succeeded in abolishing segregation in interstate commerce, in public transportation, in public accommodations, in employment. And then in 1968, it succeeded in getting the passage of a Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then in the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much went away and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Everyone that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we persuaded the country and came to believe that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, how could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We remained content to live in an apartheid society as we do today. Well, partly it's because ending residential segregation, redressing it, is hard. If we abolish segregation in restaurants, the next day you sit anywhere you want in a restaurant and go to any restaurant you want. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites, Northerners, Southerners, is we've adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not continuing the civil rights struggle to redress this biggest segregation of all. And the excuse we give ourselves is something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of lunch counters or buses or swimming pools or schools, that was all done by government, by ordinance, by public policy, by law, by regulation. And if it was done by the federal government, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, something we're obligated to remedy because it's unconstitutional. If it was done by state and federal government, it was a 14th Amendment violation, something we're also obligated to remedy because it's a civil rights violation and violation of the Constitution. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, by law, by regulation. We have residential segregation just because it happens naturally. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or bigoted landlords or homeowners refuse to rent or sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves that because of actors in the private economy, businesses, banks, real estate agencies, private actors acting in a discriminatory fashion. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, so many of them cannot afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods, higher cost neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, self-choice, economic differences is what created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened naturally, what happened by accident, can only unhappen by accident, can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization, this excuse we've adopted. We say what we've got is de facto segregation, just sort of something that happened in fact, but not intentional in any way. Well, I spent many years as an education policy writer. I didn't get engaged in housing policy and the history of segregation until fairly recently. And as an education policy writer in the 1990s and 2000s, I spent a lot of time criticizing the dominant educational theory of the country. At that time, and we still do, had an achievement gap between Black and white children. African American children achieve at lower levels on average than white children do. And we adopted the idea that the reason there was an achievement gap was because teachers had low expectations of Black children. They just didn't try very hard. And only if we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought it was a ludicrous theory, but we enacted it into law. In 2001, we adopted the No Child Left Behind law that required children to be tested every year and made provision for punishing teachers and schools that didn't close the achievement gap as a result, simply by trying harder and paying attention to children's test scores. Well, I remember writing one column, for example, about asthma. As you know, perhaps, African American children in urban neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots stirring up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child without asthma to be up at night wheezing and coming to school sleepy the next day or drowsy. Not every child who has asthma is up at night sleepy, but the chances are that if you have asthma, you're more likely to be drowsy in school. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic backgrounds, same family structure, all of these identical characteristics except for one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement by a small amount, no matter how hard teachers try, no matter how often those children are tested. Well, when you start thinking about all of the other conditions that have a similar impact on achievement, the result of the social and economic conditions from which children come, asthma, lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity, when you add them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. It's not that some teachers aren't bigoted and have low expectations, but that's not the major cause of it. Well, I was writing a lot about these kinds of things, and then I realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness, but what happens if every child in a school has one or more of these conditions? How can a school like that ever be expected to have achievement at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished, well-fed, and in economically secure homes? Well, we can pass as many laws as we want saying that simply by trying harder, those schools will have the same average achievement, but it won't happen. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's how I came to this work. I still wasn't thinking of myself as an expert on housing policy or segregation. I wanted to write a book about educational policy relying on neighborhood segregation. Well, I was thinking about all of this in 2007 when I read a Supreme Court decision involving 2 school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. Both of these school districts had a choice plan in which parents could choose which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and both a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the Black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and both a Black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court denounced it. They said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice Roberts. The Chief Justice said that, yes, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. But he said the neighborhoods in Seattle and Louisville are segregated de facto for the reasons I described before. Economic differences, self-choice, private bigotry, actions of private businesses. And he said, if you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government, government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about something some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two school districts that was involved in this decision. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in Louisville that in an all-white suburb, all single-family homes, all whites. The suburb was called Shively, and this homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, had a good job, wanted to raise his family in a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in this all-white suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop any of this activity. But when this riot was all over, the white homeowner was charged, tried, convicted by the state of Kentucky for sedition and sentenced to 15 years for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the prosecutors, the courts are all aligned in an effort to maintain the racial boundaries of Louisville. And I began to look into it further. And I found that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases like this. I'm not exaggerating in those numbers, of mob violence, frequently protected by the police, often led and instigated by the police to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police were protecting, instigating, sometimes leading violence to drive African Americans out of white neighborhoods, every one of them was a constitutional violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment that we, all of us, have an obligation to remedy, but we've never done so.